Hi, I'm Kevin Keller, the pragmatic statistician. In the last episode of Street Stats, we spoke about the use of statistical process control, or SPC, in the creation of baseline data. We focused our energy on day one problems. Today, we're going to look at recent problems. Now, recent problems are just that. The performance of our process was operating at some level, and at some point in time, something happened. It could be a trend, a shift, a collection of upset conditions, and any sort of combination thereof. Whatever it is, this outcome also has two major impacts on our project. With regards to data collection, you want to isolate your data analysis on those periods of good performance versus bad performance. You're looking for some sort of signal. Oftentimes, we focus only on trying to model bad data or bad performance. You want to contrast the data, good versus bad. Now, secondly, in this particular situation, it is possible that there is a silver bullet to discovering the root cause. Now, the solution may be challenging, but at least you know the root cause. Great root cause analysis, drilling down deeply, is definitely required. Now, the possibilities can be varied, so we're going to look at three different examples. We're going to go back to our friend on-time shipping. As a reminder, we have 5 years of monthly on-time shipping data, but this time I'm going to alter the data a bit to create some different scenarios. So off we go to EngineRoom. As a reminder, we had on-time shipping, and I'm going to create a little bit of a shift in that data. So let's see what happens. So we're going to go to our friend, control charts, and X moving range chart. And if we click on that, we have a shift. And I always love putting in the time variable so we can clearly see it. And we're just going to click continue through all the options. And again, most statistical software, the options are exactly what you want. So all of a sudden, we see that we were clocking along at some point, and then our data shifted downwards. And in manufacturing SPC, we talk about, oh, well, we've got to study this point and this point, this point. These are out of control. And that's a red herring. That is not what we see. We see that there's a definite shift to the data. Now, down here in the moving range, you'll notice that the moving range actually picked up this shift. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. So you're lucky if it does, but it's trained to do that if the shift is large enough. So it's important that we go in, we dig into the data. Did the shift really occur, or the root cause really occur in November of 23, or did the change actually occur prior to that? So you have to do a little bit of investigative work. So I'm going to repeat this analysis, and this time we're going to do an SPC chart. And I did some analysis to figure out when that shift actually happened. And so we have shift phase, and that'll hopefully will do the trick. And sure enough, when you were doing your investigation, something happened in November. And now we can clearly see that our data was relatively stationary up until October, November of 2023, and then something happened. Now, in this particular case, if something were to happen and you could return back to the previous state, we'd call that a recent problem. And that recent problem started in November of 2023. In this particular case, we find out upon investigation that we were using a given truck carrier and they went out of business. So we had to go to a new truck carrier, and this is their performance. So we went from 90% down to 85%. If we could go back to that previous truck carrier, we'd call that a recent problem. But now this is our new state. So this is a day one problem starting in November of 2023. So a little tricky, but not too bad. So you're constantly asking the question, do I have a day one problem or a recent problem? So we're going to change things up a bit. We're now going to put in a trend in our data and ask those same questions. So we click continue a bunch of times. And let's increase the size of this. So we were clocking along at about 90% as we've learned. And then we can definitely see that something has turned downwards. And then maybe it's stabilized out a bit. Maybe it's a little more stationary, a little challenging to tell. Um, so the challenge that you're always going to have is exactly when are you going to declare that the trend started? And so you have to go look and ask questions. So in this particular case, you start digging into the data and you find out that a couple of things happened that's going to influence your assessment of where we are. So we're going to put in, and I've got a phase for trend. We'll put that in, and we'll say okay, or continue and continue. And so it turns out a couple of things were going on. The change was actually made in May of 2023, but it didn't show up for a while. And this often happens with data. We just say, well, the number physically changed kind of in July or August, but it actually took place, the shift took place or was initiated in May. So you figured that out looking, and you understand what caused this to occur, and you have to dig in. Then we have where things stabilized, and what you learn is the director for shipping made a big stink, and people started getting serious about making sure we were hitting our on-time shipping numbers. So we had a recent problem. And now we are in back to a day one problem with our new state. Now, if you can flip a switch and get it back to this state, then it's a recent problem all around. If this is your new reality, you're back to a day one problem, which requires a fundamental redesign of the process. So, a little more challenging, but nevertheless, we can use that. So we're going to look at one more. We are going to do an X moving range chart, but this time I created a series of outliers with my data, and we will see what that looks like. Again, we're going to click continue through all of our options. And our eye immediately sees the out of control points. And sometimes there will be alerts in statistical software that will say, you have some out of control points. Do you wish to continue or do you want to hide those? And the answer is no, never. I don't want to hide those. I want to learn from those. So we can see that December of 2023 is out of control. So we need to go investigate that. But if you're looking a bit more, you can see that we have December of 2023 and December of 2022 out of control on the moving range. And all of a sudden, our eyes discover that each of the Decembers are low points. So, do we have a recent problem or do we have a day one problem? So, we can hypothesize that, all right, December seems to be problematic as we're going through and analyzing the data, but we really do have a day one problem. It's not a recent problem. And so we could add on uh, stages just like we did with the other. And it turns out that when you're doing your discussion, your root cause analysis, that people go, you know what? Not only do we have problems in December, we also have problems in May. And it turns out that the rationalization is Mother's Day. So in May and December, we're unusually competing for resources. So as we look at the data, even though today we say, well, we're working on recent problems, we really have to take a deep dive into, do we have these out of control points, meaning we have a recent problem or a day one problem? So May seems to be problematic and December seems to be problematic. Now, let's go back. We're constantly asking, do we have a day one problem or a recent problem? And so if I can flip a switch and my target is 90%, if my target is 90%, then I need to fix these unusual cases of May and December. If my target is not 90%, but 93%, then I've got to go back and redesign everything. So again, I can't answer that question for you. What is the exact business situation? But you're constantly challenging, do I have a day one problem or do I have a recent problem? All right. Now, in these cases, I made it obvious. But here's the deal. If it isn't obvious, treat it as a day one problem, because likely the gap you are attempting to close is much, much larger than any subtle shifts that might be going on. Even if you found those subtle issues, you will not have closed the gap. You're still going to have to redesign the process. So let's recap where we are. The major goal of the measure phase is creating baseline assessment. Do we have a day one problem or do we have a recent problem? The SPC chart is an excellent tool to help answer this question, but don't get wound up about stability and investigating every out of control point. So be careful out there. The streets are messy and so is data. But remember, there is always a way.